I remember the wait for a new Metroid game. That was the years 2010 to 2016. I remember how angry the fan base was when the new game was. I know we all hate this game because it was the first game in 6 years, but it isn't actually that bad, especially with friends. Anyway, I wasn't a fan of this series until Samus Returns was out, but when I became a fan and started to look at the older games in the series, I was surprised to see that there was a time where people had to wait even longer for a new game. Super Metroid was released in 1994. The next game was released in 2002. 8 years. But when the wait was over, we got 2 new Metroid games. A new 2D game that takes place after Super Metroid, and the first 3D Metroid game. And people were angry. When they showed footage of this 3D Metroid game and it was first person, fans raged. Some of them were hoping the game would fail. Metroid is not a first person shooter. Once these games were released, the mindsets of the fans kinda swapped. Now Prime was the masterpiece we all waited for, and Fusion was a disappointing follow-up to Super. Obviously, there are people who like both games. There were even back then. But if you go back to old message boards and read what some people were saying about Prime before it released, compared to after it released, you'll see what I mean. The coolest part of the release of Prime was how the developers, Retro Studios, proved themselves. Not just to fans, but also Nintendo. Before this, Retro never really released a game. But after the success of Prime, Nintendo let them make a whole trilogy of Metroid games, and after that they went on to revive another beloved Nintendo series. Fans love Retro Studios. So much so, when it was revealed that they were not working on Prime 4, people were mad. Prime 4 has been in development for years now, but Nintendo did say that Retro Studios is now helping with Prime 4's development. With all that being said, if Retro Studios prove themselves to not just the fans, but also the publishers, as well as the game spawning a trilogy of beloved games, Metroid Prime must be an incredible game. And it is. So let's get into it. This intro is incredible. In 2002, seeing Samus in 3D for the first time must have been awesome, especially considering how good this game looks. This video is using footage of the recently released remaster, and even on the GameCube, Samus's 3D debut holds up incredibly well even today. And hearing that familiar tune as well as finally getting to see Samus will always get me excited to play this game, no matter how many playthroughs I do. After the game makes sure you know how to lock on the targets and shoot, you go inside the space station to see that something inside has been destroying everything. There's a bunch of debris that you have to use charge shots on so you can continue further. The space station is obviously just a big tutorial, but it does a good job at being a tutorial as well as being an exciting prologue to the game that makes people want to play more. This era of video games had some of the best tutorials / intros to games ever. It felt like after the 6th generation of consoles, some games tutorialized everything, where this generation's tutorials only taught the players the mechanics that were unique to the game they were playing. For example, Metroid Prime teaches the player how to lock on targets, shoot missiles, use the grapple beam, and use the scan visor. The scan visor is a mechanic that some love and some hate. I'm kind of in the middle about it. When it's used well, I think it's a great way to give the world of Prime more depth. Being able to scan enemies to learn more about the creature, or scanning statues or ancient artifacts to learn more about the planet and the people who used to live on it. The 2D games did this type of stuff in the background of areas, so players could put the pieces together to understand what happened to these places. But not all players care about the lore of this series, and just care about the gameplay, so I think it's good that most of the scannable objects are optional. I did say most because just like the tutorial shows you, some doors need to be scanned to be opened. You also have to scan bosses to find their weak spots so you can do more damage to them. Anyway, after the Parasite Queen boss fight, Ridley attacks the space station and it's time for an escape. I feel like we've done this before. Also, during this, Samus loses her power-up so we can collect them all again. It's a video game, there's no way to avoid this. I just wish that they came up with a better reason for Samus losing her upgrades other than an explosion blows Samus against a wall. But once Samus escapes, she sees Ridley flying towards the planet Talon 4, so Samus gets in her ship and follows him. This is where the real game starts, where you search the areas to find new upgrades and power-ups. Kinda like when Samus landed on Zebes in Super. Okay, let's get this out of the way. I've heard Prime be described as Super Metroid, but in 3D. I don't agree with this at all. While Prime is definitely inspired by Super, I bet the developers would even admit that. Prime just did what a lot of other series did when they made their jump to 3D. Take what works in the 2D games and alter it slightly to work in this world. 2D and 3D games are very different. So even though I've ran upstairs in Metal Gear 2, doing it in Metal Gear Solid feels different. And much worse. In Super Metroid, escaping the space station is just running through a few rooms and jumping up some platforms. In Prime, the escape is a tense cinematic set piece that will stick with the player. That's why I don't call this just Super Metroid in 3D, because it feels more like a cinematic and immersive take on Super, but with a different plot and setting. I just used the word immersive, and a lot of people use that word when talking about this game. And it's because this game does such a good job at immersing the player into the world of Prime. I mentioned earlier the scan visor that lets you read about the history of the planet as well as learning more about the inhabitants of Talon 4. The first-person perspective wasn't just used to appeal to the first-person shooter fans, it was also used to get players to feel like they're in the role of Samus Aran. For the first time we can see what Samus sees, so the X-ray visor went from being a beam of light to actually being X-ray vision. Also, Samus's jump feels pretty floaty. It might not sound like it would matter when the topic is immersion, but in the 3 previous games, Samus's jump was pretty floaty. So, for me at least, Samus having a floaty jump in Prime helped it feel like I was playing as the character from those games. This game has so much detail that most developers wouldn't usually bother with, but Retro Studios added them so the players could get more immersed. Details like Samus's reflection on the visor, or how charging the ice beam actually starts to freeze Samus's arm cannon. And I could keep going, but I should probably start talking about the gameplay. As of now, there are 3 different versions of Metroid Prime. All 3 of them have 3 different control schemes. The GameCube version has a pretty out-of-date control scheme. You use the left analog stick to go forward, back, and turn left and right. If you want to walk left or right without turning, you have to hold down the right trigger. You can also hold down the trigger to look up and down. I do actually like these controls, but they are definitely dated. I can understand if someone said they couldn't play this game with these controls. The Wii version on the Metroid Prime trilogy uses motion controls, where you point the controllers where Samus will shoot. Other than that, the controls aren't much different, other than now you have to point the Wiimote towards the left or right of the screen to turn around. Now for the version I'm playing for this video, the recently released Metroid Prime Remaster on the Switch, the remaster uses a more modern control scheme. The left analog stick moves Samus, and the right lets you look in the direction you move it. But if you want the GameCube or Wii controls, the remaster allows you to switch the controls, which is nice. So the controls are good, but one of the most important parts of a Metroidvania is the map design and map traversal. And this is where I sort of start to have an issue with Metroid Prime. So we have to remember, Metroid Prime was one of the first 3D Metroidvania games. And considering that, it's pretty good. The items are hidden in areas that once you figure out how to get to them, it feels rewarding. And you should never get lost for a long period of time because the Prime games have a hint system. If you haven't reached the next mandatory area in a certain amount of time, the game will show you where you should be heading. It shows you where to go but not how to get there. So when you figure out how to get to your destination, it still feels rewarding. Most of the time. I remember my first playthrough a few years ago. There were a few moments where I would be wandering around looking for the next place to go, get the hint, and then be told I had to go a few areas away from where I currently was. One example I can think of is after I got the boost ball. I searched around Phendrana Drifts, now that I have a new upgrade, but I got lost and wasn't making any progress. The hint popped up and told me I had to go back to the Talon Overworld to get the space jump, then go back to Phendrana Drifts to get the wave beam. I remember this annoying me during my first playthrough because this never happened to me during the 2D games, other than the first game. Even in Metroid 2 with its lack of a map, I never felt completely lost. But that's probably because it's pretty linear compared to the other games in the series. Now it's a Metroidvania game, so of course there's backtracking. But in 2D games it was mostly optional. For example, in Super Metroid, after you're done in the wrecked ship, you can go back the way you came from to get some extra missiles, bombs, and energy tanks, or you can go through the back exit of the ship, which leads to some tunnels, then drops you in the Meridia, which is the next area you would usually go to now that you've gotten the gravity suit from the ship. Or how Zero Mission added a bunch of shortcuts so backtracking didn't take so much time to do. Back to Prime though. Like I said, this only happened on my first playthrough since now that I know where to go, there wasn't any examples that were that bad. There still is too much going back and forth across the entire map for my liking. But from what I remember, Prime 2 improves on this, so let's move on. Combat in the Prime games obviously had to be changed from what it was in the 2D titles due to the new perspective. In the 2D games you just press the shoot button, sometimes you jump and shoot, or sometimes you shoot at a diagonal angle. But with Prime being 3D, and more importantly, first person, Retro Studios obviously had to add more to the combat to make it more interesting. Samus can still shoot missiles and super missiles just like she could in 2D titles. She also has different types of beams. Unlike Super though, they don't stack on top of each other. The first beam is the wave beam, which is mostly used for puzzles. The plasma beam, which melts ice, and is also the most powerful beam in the game, and the ice beam, which freezes enemies. Having different types of beams might sound like it adds a lot to the combat, but all it really does is turn the combat into a game of matching colors. Oh, the enemy has purple on him, time to use the wave beam. Other than the beams, the new addition to combat is the strafe mechanic, which is exactly what it sounds like. Combat overall isn't that interesting or exciting. The bosses are kind of cool. I like using the Morph Ball bombs to beat Thardus in half the amount of time that it should usually take. But Metroid was never really known for its combat. It's mostly known for its exploration, and like I said earlier, the items are satisfying to find. And getting a new power-up will always feel rewarding due to the short cutscene each power-up gets, showing you what it does, as well as the classic item song. Starting with Prime and Fusion, that theme would only be used for major upgrades. Missile expansions and energy tanks have a new sound effect. What also makes the exploration so enjoyable is the atmosphere of Talon 4. I already talked about how immersive the world can be. One thing I didn't mention is how the music in this game helps with that. Prime's soundtrack is easily one of my favorite Metroid soundtracks, and probably one of my favorite Nintendo soundtracks. The tracks are somehow catchy and atmospheric at the same time. The soundtrack is so good that I almost don't mind the Chozo artifact hunt towards the end of the game. The last topic I want to talk about before talking about the end of the game is the Chozo artifact hunt. A lot of first-party GameCube games had moments towards the end of the game that were just there to pad out game length. Wind Waker had the Triforce Quest, for example. The reason why Wind Waker had the Triforce Hunt is because it was being rushed. I think Metroid Prime would have been a long enough game already, but maybe it was added so the game would be longer, or maybe it was being rushed. Either way, this artifact hunt kills the pace of the end of the game. I wouldn't mind it as much if you could collect these throughout the game, so you didn't have to find a bunch of them towards the end of the game. Some let you collect them early on, but most require a late game item to collect. To be fair, they do give you pretty obvious hints for where to look, but I still don't like going through the entire map again just so I can beat the game. For this playthrough, I was only missing 3 by the time I needed to get them all to progress. So I guess you can get more of them earlier than I thought. After you collect all the Chozo artifacts, it's time to fight Ridley. Fighting Ridley again reminded me of something I don't really like about the boss fights in the Prime games. A lot of them have long periods of time where you can't hurt them at all. For example, during Ridley's boss fight, Ridley, after attacking, he will fly up in the air. When he's far away, he is completely invulnerable. Towards the end of the fight, Ridley's wings get destroyed and he fights you on the ground. After you hit him enough, he will reveal his weak spot. Ridley does a lot of damage during this fight, so beating him will always feel rewarding. The final boss is one of my favorite bosses in the series. It's not very difficult, but I love the atmosphere during this fight. I also love how this boss makes you use multiple different types of beams and visors. And in classic Metroid fashion, it's time to rush back to the ship before the planet blows up. Sadly, this is just a cutscene. So, final thoughts. I think Metroid Prime is still an incredible game, but there are flaws. Combat is too easy to be interesting, and the map design can sometimes be questionable. But what Metroid Prime does well, I think it does really well. Immersing the player into the world of Talon 4. Exploration is fun, beating bosses to get new upgrades is rewarding, and there's so much more. If you somehow never played Metroid Prime, I can absolutely recommend it. I honestly forgot how much I liked Prime until I replayed it for this video. I'm curious to see how Prime 2 will compare to this game. I remember thinking Prime 2 was even better. I guess I'll see whenever I get to that game.